This week we look at Luke 6:27 to 36. This is part of Luke's Sermon on the Plain, which is his equivalent to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 to 7. Like Matthew's version, Luke's version starts with a series of beatitudes. Blessed are you who are poor, blessed are you who hunger, blessed are you when people speak poorly of you. He has about half the number of beatitudes as Matthew. Unlike Matthew, though, he then goes on and has a series of woes. Woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are well-fed. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you. And it's after that last woe that we then get our passage for this video. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Now, as I mentioned, this has parallels with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, particularly chapter 5, 38 to 48, which says, You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now it can be helpful to compare these two. This is a case where they have a lot of things in common, a lot of common themes, although the wording is not always very close. I have highlighted the parts that are the same in Greek, sometimes like with the word but, it looks the same in English, but if you look at the underlying Greek, it's not the same. We notice a couple things here at the beginning. First of all, Matthew has structured this part of the sermon differently than Luke. For Matthew, this is part of Jesus quoting Scripture and then giving a twist on it. You've heard it said, but I tell you this. Luke doesn't have that, so he doesn't quote the Scriptures at the beginning. The other thing to note is that Luke frames this whole section by the command to love your enemies. For Matthew, that doesn't show up until verse 43 and following. So here, what do they have in common? Well, I say to you, love your enemies. And then they both encourage prayer for those who are doing bad things to you. Luke expands this a bit. He also includes do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who abuse you. And the abuse here is more verbal abuse, those who insult you or who are insolent towards you, those who threaten you. Whereas Matthew has pray for those who persecute you. The next section in Luke then goes back and picks up what Matthew talks about in 38 through 42. Now here, Matthew starts with Exodus 21:24, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but Jesus has a different take. He says, do not resist an evildoer. Luke, again, doesn't have these scriptural counterpoints, possibly because Matthew is writing from a Jewish perspective and Luke is writing from a Gentile perspective. We'll see other instances where that might become important. Now, their first point of commonality here has to do with this command about being struck on the cheek. In English, it looks pretty similar. In Greek, the word for strike in Luke and Matthew is different. Matthew's word for strike is actually more of the word for slap, whereas in Luke, it's to strike, to beat, to smite, to wound. It's a much harder strike in Luke. Note that Matthew also says slaps you on the right cheek, and he specifies it's the right. Why does he specify that? Well, if you think about it, most people are right-handed. So if you're going to hit someone on the right cheek, how are you going to do it? Not by throwing a punch, because then you hit them on the left cheek. So if you're going to hit them on their right cheek, you've got to backhand them. In other words, you're slapping them with the back of your hand. This is talking about an insult. If someone insults you, let it roll off your back, right? Let them insult your other cheek too. In Luke, however, you're taking a beating. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, let them hit your other one too. And again, this is not a gentle slap. This is a punch, a strike. Similarly, in this next section, I've highlighted in green and red shirt and coat. The NRSV translate them differently in Matthew and actually uses the word coat to translate the word shirt. I don't know why they do that, but you can hopefully make sense of it with the way I have put it. Matthew presumes this kind of court setting where someone is taking you to court and they want to sue you for your shirt. And his advice is give them your coat as well, not only your shirt, but your outer garment too. Whereas in Luke, someone is actually taking your outer garment, right? In other words, this is an actual brawl. Someone is taking your coat. And what does he say? Don't withhold your shirt from them either. Give them that too. Matthew then has a bit about forcing you to go 1 mile, go a second mile. This probably has to do with military conscription and soldiers coming along and seeing someone and conscripting them to carry their equipment for a ways. This probably would have been more common in Judea under the Roman occupation. And so again, this may reflect more Matthew's Jewish perspective, whereas Luke, writing from a Gentile perspective for a clearly Gentile audience, is not as concerned with that kind of imagery. And then we get the final command, give to everyone who begs from you, which is similar in both, and then they elaborate on it a bit at the end in slightly different ways. Luke then has the famous dictum, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, curiously, this doesn't appear in Matthew until chapter 7. There, it's still part of the Sermon on the Mount, but it comes after the ask, seek, knock, and trust that your Father's going to give you good gifts. Okay, and then he says, just as your Father's going to give you good gifts, he's not going to give you bad gifts. So in everything, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So different contexts for this in Luke and Matthew. Luke puts it in the context of loving your enemies. The second half of Luke's passage, if you love those who love you, is equivalent with Matthew's version, and then they develop it a little bit differently. Again, similar ideas, but using different language. Perhaps worth noting, at the end, Matthew says, do not even the Gentiles do the same. Whereas in Luke, he's focused on sinners throughout. Again, this may reflect the fact that he's writing from a Gentile perspective for Gentiles, whereas Matthew is very conscious of Jew-Gentile distinctions, and he does a lot with those. Luke, not as much. Here he just uses the generic sinners throughout. And then we get the final exhortation. Luke comes back to the love your enemies, and here it's occurring in parallel with its Matthean equivalent. Luke talks about your reward, which we just saw in Matthew 46 on the previous slide. It says, your reward will be great and you will be children of the Most High. Matthew has children of your Father in heaven. So they both bring up this children idea, but for Luke it's of the Most High, for Matthew of your Father in heaven. The word that's translated wicked in Luke is translated as evil in Matthew. And then again, interestingly, at the end, Luke emphasizes mercy, whereas Matthew emphasizes being perfect. Okay, so Luke says, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Whereas Matthew says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So Luke is emphasizing mercy as the key theme kind of running throughout his passage. Let's take a closer look at Luke 6:32-36. Luke says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. Now, it's worth noting the way that this parallels the development in the first half of the passage. So Luke starts out, love your enemies, do good, bless and pray. And here he starts out talking about love. Okay, verse 29, he gave examples of what it means to do good to those who are not doing good to you. They're striking you on the cheek, taking away your coat. And then in verse 30, he was talking about giving to everyone who begs, give and don't expect things back. And in verse 34, he's going to talk about lending without expecting in return. Verse 31 summarized the whole thing as do unto others as you want them to do unto you. Similarly, in 35 and 36, he summarizes what he's just said, love, do good, and lend, as God does. Now, we can summarize this then, because we have three parallel statements, each of which have the same form. If you love and then do good and lend to those who are going to return your love, doing good, and what you lent them, so those who return your kindness, what credit, or the word literally here is grace, is that to you? Even sinners do the same. Okay? He is then going to explain why we do this. He says, but love your enemies, do good and lend, picking up the three things he just highlighted, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Now, he identifies two reasons here for responding in this way, for loving enemies, for doing good to those who do not do good to you, and for lending to those who are not going to pay you back. First one I want to highlight, he says it will make you children of the Most High. Every time we suffer hatred, every time we suffer an injustice, it becomes a point of transformation for us, a point of growth. The question is which way that growth is going to go. We can allow it to stir hatred and a desire to not do good in us as well, and effectively it then transforms us into the image of those who hate us, of our enemies. Or we can take that opportunity to respond in love, to respond by doing good, to respond by lending, even if we know it's not coming back to us. And that will transform us into the image of our Father, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil, or the wicked. He is merciful. Okay? So we're going to be transformed. The question is, into whose image are we going to be transformed? Are we going to be transformed into the image of our enemies? Or are we going to be transformed into the image of our God? He exhorts us to follow God's path, and we will take on God's characteristics. The second thing that he mentions, and this comes in the first part, he keeps saying, what grace is this to you? When we respond in this way, it stores up grace. 1 Peter has a similar passage. 1 Peter 2, 20-23 says, for what credit is there if when sinning and being beaten you will endure? But if when doing good and suffering you will endure, this is a grace before God, or this finds grace before God. For unto this you were called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his footsteps. And then he's going to delineate the footsteps that Christ has laid out. I've listed the first two. There's another one after this. Who did no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. Who when being reviled would not revile in return, when suffering would not threaten, but kept entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously. Okay? So when Christ was suffering, when enemies were coming against him, first of all, he did no sin. So it wasn't being canceled out because, well, in some kind of cosmic karma sense, he was getting what he deserved. No, he didn't sin, and therefore it was truly unjust when he was treated wrongly. What did he then do with that? He didn't revile in return when he was being reviled. When he was suffering, he didn't threaten to do it back to the people who were doing it to him. Instead, it says he kept entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously. Now, why was he entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously? What was the outcome he was hoping for? I think we often assume it's that you entrust yourself to the righteous judge who is going to come and smite those, ne'er-do-wells who are treating you badly. I don't think that's what Jesus was doing. We can do that. We can ask God to come and judge those who are treating us poorly, but there's a danger with that. Right? As 1 Peter 1:17 says, if you call upon as Father the one who judges impartially, live your lives in fear. In other words, God is an impartial judge. If we call for him to come down and put things right, he'll do it, but he's not going to give us special favors just because we call upon him as Father, just because we're his children. If we're doing the same thing that the people over there are doing that we're asking for him to judge, we're going to fall under the same judgment. We don't get a free pass. And remember, if people hate us and we stay focused on that, we're going to end up filled with hate too. We're going to end up doing the very things that we did not like when they were done to us. And so asking God to come down and judge puts us in danger of being judged as well. That's why right after this, Luke is going to go on and say, don't judge so that you won't be judged. Well, if that's not what Jesus is doing, then what is he doing in entrusting himself to the judge who judges righteously? Well, if the judge is going to put things right, there are two potential ways of doing that when a wrong has been committed. One is to punish the wrongdoer. Okay, now we just said we can call for God to do that and he'll do it, but that carries a danger for us as well, unless we're being perfect. The other option is to compensate the one who was treated wrongly, to try to make up for the injustice that they suffered. And this is what it means, I suggest, when it talks about there being grace available. When we suffer unjustly and we release it and then ask God to make the situation right, it means that we have a pileup of grace that we can then release into the world. So we can become his conduits of blessing and grace, right? And remember, if we're focused on God and becoming more like him, taking on his image, then what's going to happen to those who hate us and are focused on us? Well, they're also going to be transformed into that image because we become like what we focus on. If we stay focused on God, we'll become like him. If we view these situations through his eyes, we'll become like him. If we focus on those who hate us, we're going to become like them. We're going to become filled with hate. So this week, look for opportunities to build up your storehouse of grace that you can then release into the nations. And we'll talk about this more on Sunday.